And in his mind, he failed. And in his perception, he failed. And literally within a year, he was back on meth. His family, they didn't have any money. He had abandoned them because of this idea of failure. It was just an idea. You see this behavior all the time in humanity. And it's an amazing thing that just gets in the way of our transformation.
Welcome back to The Art of Accomplishment, where we explore living the life you want with enjoyment and ease. I'm Brett Kistler, here today with my co-host, Joe Hudson.
Hey, Brett, how's it going?
On today's episode, we're going to talk about failure.
Yeah, we are. We're going to talk about failure. The thing about failure that is so critical is that it is just an idea. And it's an idea that when you have it, because of the way that the brain is structured, when you have this idea that I failed, your ability to try again goes way down. You give up far more easily when you have this idea of, oh, I failed. The idea of failure, which is just an idea, is one of the things that we design our entire programs to prevent. And it is an idea that when you have it, can totally stop you in your tracks, can make it so that you don't want to try anymore. It is a structure in the brain called the habenula that basically its job is to make sure that you don't fail. And so if you have this idea of failure, your capacity to keep on trying and iterating goes way down. And so to really understand failure can absolutely transform the way that you do personal development work and the way that you achieve stuff in the world. So to me, it's critical to think about failure differently than most people do. The idea of failure it has to just be an idea. I mean, if you take a look at, say, Sam Walton, right? So this guy starts Walmart. You know, some people think he's evil, some people think he's great, but whatever it was, he was on a boat coming back from World War II, and he thought to himself, you know, autocracies in the world, the problem with them is that they don't have a middle class. I need to support the middle class of America. So his way to do it was to increase the buying power of the middle class, give stock options to clerks. He did all this stuff to help the middle class. Oddly, you know, it changed over time, but that was his thing. That's what he wanted to do. And he failed the first time. First five and dime failed, second five and dime failed, third five and dime Walmart, right? And then Sam's Club, and then everything else that him and his family did, the restoration of the Colorado River and all the restoration of the Sonoran and the stuff they're doing with like rhinos in Africa right now, all of that propelled because he apparently failed, but he didn't fail. You know, and I don't think anyone's going to look at Sam Walton and go, oh, that dude was a failure. So the idea of failure is time limited. Like you have to think that there is a time line on life and that there's some end to it. As long as you don't think there's an end, there is no such thing as failure. Yeah. There's just the next iteration, the next attempt, the next experiment, the next try. But if your mind says, no, I failed, then the way that the mind is structured with this part of the brain called the habenula, boom, you're going to say, oh, wow, I failed. And then your chances of trying again go way down. How many times you're going to try again goes way down. And so it's really important to reframe just the concept of failure.
That's really interesting, this idea of an end, because I think in our work, we talk a lot about the false end. And, you know, in skydiving or base jumping, we would often say that any jump you walk away from is a success. And then the corollary there is a jump that you die on is a failure. And it just seems like, duh. What do you have to say about when a failure is defined as, well, my company ended, therefore it's a failure. It's just a failure, and then I move on.
The problem is, so the part of the brain called the habenula, its job is to, and of course this is neuroscience, so everything's going to change in 5-10 years. But generally, the thing about the habenula, it is a regulator for the dopamine and the serotonin production. And so basically what it's designed to do is help you succeed. If you're, say, like a rat running a maze, you'd go one way and it doesn't work. This part of the brain is designed to tell you don't go that way again. Mm-hmm. If you are a bear and you're fighting for mating rights, or a lion fighting for mating rights, and you fail, that part of the brain says, don't try again because you're going to get killed. So don't do that. And that's what it's designed to do. It's designed to say, hey, here's how you succeed by not expressing the reward of success when you have failure, right? And so there's even studies that show people who are depressed often have the habenula is not working in the same way. It's perceiving failure even before it happens, so then you don't even try, right? And if you think about the way people who are depressed feel, as an example, they think about it as there's no way out. There's never going to be a way out. I'm never going to succeed. Like this is going to last forever. That's like the symptom of depression, and the habenula is involved in that. So generally, the studies that have been done, and there's this woman whose name escapes me. We'll put it in the show notes, but her name escapes me. She's in one of the Stanford labs, and what she's discovered is that people who are successful, and I think the way her study went was, we'll put it in case I've got some of this wrong, but the way her study went was she went into populations that didn't have a lot of resources and looked to see who actually lost weight when they tried. And the people who lost weight when they tried, their mindset was never, I failed. Their mindset was, what's the next iteration? What's the next thing we do? What's the next attempt? It's a constant iterative mindset, which you see in Silicon Valley as well. Fail fast is another one. It's like the idea is that everything that you're doing is an iteration, it's an attempt, and it's a reframing of failure to experimentation. And if you look at like the way our courses are designed, we're teaching folks that it's not about failure, it's about iteration. We do experiments. We don't say, here's an exercise, here's what you have to learn. We talk about want over should, because if I should do it and I don't do it, then I failed. And so that creates a situation where, I'm trying to get out of a bad habit. And then that moment where you go back to the bad habit, you don't see it as an iteration. You don't see it as a pendulation. You're like, I failed. And then I'm going to stop trying.
What I'm hearing there is that learning is going to happen either way. We're evolved to learn no matter what happens. But what we learn depends on what we make of it. And failure is something that will, however we define failure causes us to learn to stop trying that thing, which is ultimately keeps us very safe if it's well calibrated.
Correct.
As we become more complex, adults, how does our sense of failure change from when we're children? If we're a child, we might only be able to recognize a certain level of complexity of, the definition of a task and whether or not we succeeded or failed. And so I wonder to what extent that kind of carries forward into our adulthood. And that's kind of part of what needs to be deprogrammed and kind of reprocessed in the work.
The idea is, how do you get into an iterative mindset? How do you redefine or reframe failure? That's the important part. So if you look at kids, one of the main things that they have for their reward system, like what's the cheese at the end of their maze? It's mom and dad's love and attention. That's or love and attention generally.
Yeah.
Right. So if they keep on failing at getting that, if they keep on failing at getting the attunement that they need, if they keep on failing to get the connection that they need, if they keep on failing to get the love that they need, then they grow up with this incredibly critical voice in the head telling them that they're failing all the time, even when they're not. I'll give you an example of this. My father was the CEO of a company, and that company fired him. And then he got a job as another CEO of a company. And at the end of that, the owners of the company, which was another company, so he was the parent company, basically fired him and said, you failed. And my dad was just like, I'm a failure. And his whole life just like went down the tubes. It's when he started drinking heavily and everything he did went wrong. And it was just like, it was horrible, like just a horrible thing. And later on in life, I'm a venture capitalist and I am walking around this trade show looking for investments. And there's this company, it's called Lume Energy. And I was like, that sounds a lot like the company my dad ran called Lumen Optics. So I went over, I was like, what do you guys do? And they told me this is what we do. I was like, wow, this sounds like a company called Lumen Optics. They're like, oh, that's who we used to be. I was like, really? Like, well, my dad used to, run the company. And they're like, oh, John Hudson, yeah. What I found out was that my dad was so successful at running the company that the parent company that didn't want this company to exist because it was a competitive product to their main, manufacturing facilities and everything like that, basically shelved the company. And they said, yeah, no. And these folks sued the parent company, won $100 million or something, say you shelved us. It was a breach of contract. And so they lost $100 million. And now with this new $100 million, they're restarting the company.
Wow.
And so my dad's entire life went downhill because he thought he failed when he actually hadn't failed. So I started to ask for the numbers. Literally, I'm like, what happened? And I started asking for the numbers. I went and talked to my dad about it too. I was like, tell me the numbers. And he basically turned a company that was losing something, it was like burning $300,000. And he had turned that around to only burning 10,000 in less than 2 years. And their revenue had increased by something like 300 or 400%. So it was definitely on the right trajectory. And I was like, your whole life defined by a failure that didn't actually exist. And so that's the crazy thing is like, especially somebody who's depressed, they can look at anything and turn it into a failure. They can look at anything and say, oh, I didn't succeed. It wasn't perfect, because nothing's perfect. Nothing is perfect. That you can look at anything and say, see, I wasn't perfect. I failed.
Yeah. And how did that impact you? How old were you when this occurred and your dad started to see himself as a failure?
Yeah, I was about the 7th grade, 8th grade, somewhere in there, maybe 9th grade is when it started happening heavily. Yeah, I mean, the alcoholism that at least to some degree was propelled by it. He was a heavy drinker already. That whole like shame cycle that he went into, yeah, I like lost my dad even more than I had already lost my dad. What actually usually happens is that like he would take his own self-anger out on me. So he yelled at me for an hour and a half over the dinner table every night. Mm. It was crazy. This one idea that he failed, where he could have been like, oh, I succeeded. And those guys like, tried to hamstring me because of the success that I was having. If he had that thought process, and he's like, I'm a successful CEO, my life, his life, my sister, my mom's, everybody's life would be different. The crazy thing is that, so I've seen people do something where they do the like power of positive thinking. And so they don't look at the reality on the ground. Right. But I don't think that's about failure or non-failure. Mm-hmm. That's about like over optimism or not wanting to feel your negative emotions. It's like a completely different thing. So yeah, you're going to be disappointed. Yeah, you're going to be sad. Yeah, like I have been a venture capitalist. I've had companies that I love that have not succeeded. I had to mourn. It's not about like, no, everything's going to be okay. It's not a Pollyannish thing. But it's also looking at that and saying, yeah, that was an iteration. A company did not succeed. What did I learn? How does my next iteration change because of that? Like if I'm solving a problem, I'm going to fail. If it's a complicated problem, I'm going to fail many, many, many times. And if I see them as failure, I'm going to stop. I'm not going to want to solve the problem. If I see them as iteration, if I see them as a series of experiments where I'm learning, then I'm always winning. I'm never failing because I'm always learning. Yeah. And that iterative mindset is like the important thing. And the iterative mindset, particularly I will say when it comes to personal transformation, it's not just, did this work? Did this not work? What am I going to iterate on? It's like, sometimes it's how long it works, right? I remember many times where I would try a tool and then it would stop working. It worked and then it would stop working. And then it worked and then it would stop working. And then it worked and then it stopped working. And it took me a long time to realize that the reason that the tools stopped working were almost always the same. And it was because they went from wonder and inquiry and like, what is going on here, to, oh, I can manage myself through this tool.
Yeah.
And as soon as I tried to manage myself, I wasn't actually welcoming my experience and the tool stopped working. And so there was this recognition of even the idea of I need to manage myself sets up failure. Because at some point, you can't always manage yourself. You're going to fail, and then the whole thing goes apart. Where if it's like, oh, it's just an exploration, I'm just learning, then the tools keep on working.
Something that I'm noticing here is that in the instances that you were talking about, like what your dad could have learned from that experience, what we could have learned from any experience that we labeled as failure, or what we could have learned from an experience that we were kind of Pollyannically kind of grazing over the top of, is that there's a lot more subtlety to reality than we previously had modeled. And to get there, there's a lot of emotions we have to feel. We have to sit with that complexity. It sounds like what we're talking about here with failure, it's like a inverse Pollyanna, where it's like, I don't want to feel all of what I have to feel. Perhaps your dad might have had to actually recognize that he had succeeded and that wasn't actually enough for the company because other forces outside of his control were happening, and there'd be heartbreak in that. And so how much is failure, or this idea of failure, like the perhaps the premature idea of failure, or the simplistic story of failure that prevents us from really getting the full experience, how much is that a protection or a identity or avoiding an emotional experience?
The interesting thing is, like, if you bring that all the way into where it goes really deep, like in depression, where the person's like, why even get up? Why even live? Right? Because it's just going to all be shit. That's how far this thing goes, right? Like everything I've done is failure. Why even get up? Why now? It's just fuck it. I'm just going to kill myself, right? I'm going to like, is that an identity? That's a great question. Like, what's actually happening there? Leaving that place, I'm sure is going to be scary, right? And so somehow or another, being where you are, even if it's hell, is somehow more comforting than being in someplace new. If you feel like you're failing, don't try. And so to me, I would say that the emotional avoidance is something that is really important and is going to allow you to succeed. And reframing failure is something that's really important and is going to allow you to succeed. I mean, I've told this story before. I have a guy who cuts my hair who's this great artist. And I've done this many times now. And he wasn't being able to sell in galleries. And I said to him, look, hey man, I'll give you $1,000 if you get whatever, I can't remember anymore, 25, 50 rejections inside of a month or two or whatever it was. Every failure was a success. That reframe. He was like, oh, I'm closer to getting to my goal of $1,000. And then now he's like a working artist because gallery said yes. But the reframe was, I am winning if I get failures. That's all he needed was that reframe.
So now I'm curious for listeners here. I'm hearing like a number of possible entry points for doing this work. One of them is taking an inventory or account of like, what stories do you have of failure? Like there's the explicit ones that you tell yourself every day. And then there's implicit ones that have just become kind of baked into the subconscious. Like, I'm just not that kind of person. I'm not an artist because somebody didn't like my art once.
Because I failed when I was a kid. Yeah, exactly.
To start with that, with the excavating of failure stories, what's something that listeners could do as a practice or as an experiment to start to excavate those stories to investigate them more deeply?
Yeah, I think there's the investigation, but I'm not sure how necessary that is for reframing. Let's say you've always tried to lose weight and you haven't succeeded, as an example. What we normally do is we say, oh, we're going to do this diet. We're going to try. X amount of time goes by. Then we fail in some way and we give up, right? Next time you want to lose weight, sit down and write 50 experiments you can run about losing weight. I'm going to do an Ayurvedic diet. I'm going to do a traditional Chinese medicine diet. I'm going to do the Atkins diet. I'm going to try this exercise, this exercise, this exercise. I'm going to I'm going to count calories. Oh, I'm going to control my blood sugar. I'm going to wear a blood sugar monitor. I'm going to work with my hormones. Like there's so many ideas of how to lose weight. Write down every experiment that you're going to do and then do them in order. Oh, so now, I failed at that. It becomes, I tried that. Now I'm going to try this. And what do I learn? What am I going to try this? What am I going to learn? And each one of those is going to teach you something about your situation, about how you think about food, about how you think about weight, about how you think about exercise. How do I enjoy it? This week I'm going to exercise, but my number one job is to enjoy it. This week I'm going to exercise and I'm going to try to do like the heaviest cardio that I can do. This week's all going to be about weight and strength. Whatever, like just experiment after experiment. So to me, more important than going back into and excavating the ideas of failure, which I think is important, is to start to getting a taste of what it is to reframe the idea of failure. Because once you have that, then the exploration, I think, is much easier than if you are going to explore stuff, but you don't have a taste of what it is to have an iterative mindset.
Yeah. Yeah. And when I say excavation, one of the reasons for that is simply so you have something to reframe. Like, because a lot of that could be subconscious.
Yeah. So I would say the first place to reframe, that's great. The first place to reframe is the thing that you want to do next, is that thing that you want in life that you've been not able to achieve, whether that is like finding a lover, finding a husband or a wife, losing weight, starting a business, blah, blah, blah. Like, take whatever that thing is that's been hard for you that you don't want to go out and do because you feel like you fail every time you do it, and come up with 50 or 60 iterations that you can try.
Let's say somebody does this work, they do some reframing. A lot of times people will continue to self-sabotage what they think they want, and it'll be a fear of success that's actually underneath that sabotage. How would you relate the fear of success to the propensity to develop a story of failure?
So I think to some degree, the iterative mindset helps with the fear of success, because every time you're iterating, you're starting to taste success. Not success in the goal because there's no more goal, right? Like the whole thing about iterative mindset is that you kind of have a North Star. You're like, oh, I want to end up here. But the way I'm going to get there isn't by getting there. The way I'm going to get there is just learning. I'm just going to learn enough that eventually that problem gets solved. If you're like trying to solve a puzzle and you come into that puzzle and you're like, I want to solve this puzzle. I want to solve this puzzle. I want to solve this puzzle. The impartiality of view goes away and you're just going to be like, get frustrated and more frustrated. I don't want to do this anymore. Fuck this. Right. But if you're like, oh, I'm just here to learn about the puzzle. What is this? What is that? How do I do this? How do I do that? Eventually that puzzle gets solved. It just does. Eventually you're going to learn enough where just the awareness, just the learning is going to solve the problem for you. And so the more that you can have your North Star as like this thing out there, but your objective in the partiality you have is just to learn, not to get to the end, the quicker the whole process goes.
I love how a lot of what you're saying here in the reframing is that you're reframing the criteria for success from an outcome to a process. Like I'm succeeding if I'm iterating, I'm succeeding if I'm learning. And I trust that if I'm iterating and I'm learning, I'm going to get a better result. Tracing this back to the fear of success, I think a lot of times a fear of success is actually a projected future fear of failure. Like what if my art ends up in galleries and then I'm judged?
That's a huge part of it. And there's also the part of the emotional experience of like, oh my God, I'm winning. I feel good. Like that is scary. It's scary to have really positive emotions. And you know, you can see it. You're like pleasure is available to us at any minute, any day, just by the way that we breathe. And most people are not experiencing it because it's a little bit scary. So I do think that those are the two main things that make the fear of success happen, is that expansive feeling that is overwhelming. And, oh, now I'm going to be able to fail on a bigger stage.
As people start to work with a different way of being, often we'll try that new way of being and then something will happen and we'll revert back to an old one. And so one way that that might look is somebody's like, okay, you know what? I'm going to start experimenting. I'm going to try to get a bunch of rejections. And then they step out there and they get a particularly painful, possibly public rejection. And then that they just go straight back into the failure. There's like an implosion. How can somebody be ready for that or be prepared for such a moment where they've changed their way of being and then all of a sudden they step on a rake and have that experience and be able to reframe even that without imploding?
That's where some emotional fluidity is really, really useful. The framing itself, that stepping on a rake, the rake that you step on means that your reframing really wasn't complete. I'll give you an example of this. One of the things you'll notice about all of our work is that we never talk about self-improvement. We only talk about self-awareness or self-realization or understanding yourself. The reason we do that is because you will fail at self-improvement. Like the framing of self-improvement is failure, is there will be a failure in it. Self-awareness, you can't fail at. You just keep on learning and iterating. So if that break happens, it means somewhere in the reframing hasn't been complete, right? And so, or there's an emotion that you don't want to feel, right? So there's still going to be disappointment. There's still going to be sadness. There's still going to be, you know, like all the feelings of fear and all that stuff. They're not going away with the reframing. And so it's still really important to feel them and to process them and to let them all move through, as we talk about in other podcasts. And so if you step on the rake, feel the emotion that you need to feel, and then go back to the list. And that's why I say put that list up front. If you put that list up front before you attempt do your first thing, write that whole list down, because then it's just like, oh, what's the next experiment? And frame it so that every time you make a check on an experiment, it's a win. Like you're checking off a task list. You know, every one of those is a win. So it's like that. It's like, oh, win, win, win.
Yeah.
And feel the emotions that you have to feel on the way through.
I think that's something to watch for too. If people try these iterations and these experiments and they continue to have the same stories of failure come back out of it, then it's probably a sign that there's some emotional experience that you have been creating a little wall around with that story of failure. And that's something to explore.
A lot of the time, the story of failure is designed to not allow you to feel a certain emotion. That's the thing with depression that we talk about. Like one of the main things that I've seen work to have people move through depression is allow their anger to move. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of the time, what's doing that feeling of failure is doing is making it so you don't have to get angry at mom and dad for not being attuned, not loving, always being critical, you know? And so like, because you couldn't feel that as a kid,
right.
because they would just fucking annihilate you. If you're freaking 2 foot tall and there's a 6 foot tall person yelling at you, that's not a place where anger is safe to go.
Yeah, and it may even be protecting you from losing the idea of an ideal parent, like losing that ideal.
Correct.
I failed in earning their love. Then that's perhaps easier. The world is less unsafe to me than me taking on the belief at age 4 that my parents are just as confused as I am right now.
The world is not safe, even in the way that it's supposed to be for me. Correct.
Yeah.
This thing goes so deep. The most horrific story that I have around this still makes me sad to talk about it is I was in my 20s. I was recording an album and met this guy who was restoring habitat named Fred, and now like the godfather of my child. And he had a guy working for him who was an amazing human being, just amazing. He at some point was like living in his car on meth in the drug game and turned his life around. And he was a loving human being. He had kids who were generous, who were open-hearted. He took in kids from other homes. Like if there was like a kid that he found, and even though they didn't have money, they were always like, yeah, you just come in, live in the garage. And so they had their family, they had other kids from the area that didn't have good parents. And I like when I went over to his house the first time, his 8-year-old offered me his toy. He was like, here's the toy, like you can have it. And he was just providing this amazing nest of love. And he just really cared about his kids. And his eldest son, which was, I think the son that kind of brought him out of his meth haze and drug haze, when he was like 17, noticed he was drinking too much, noticed that there was a problem. And he said, hey, Dad, I want to go to rehab. I want to do therapy. And his dad saw that as a failure. I failed. My son was supposed to, I did all this work and my son still is having problems. He's going to repeat the life that I had. I remember talking to him. I'm like, dude, I don't think you screwed up. I think like for a kid to be able to see that they needed that and ask for it for themselves, like that's a huge win. And he was like, no, that's total failure. Inside of a year, he was back on meth and he was living in a car again. I saw the wife maybe like a year later and she was just like, yeah, they didn't have the money because he was providing. And so the whole family fell apart because he had an idea that he failed. It wasn't even a true thing.
This is something that's in the water we swim in culture and often shows up in companies. And it can be in families like you were just describing. Now, I'm curious now how much the son feels like he failed because the father went that way and it was a result of his blah, blah, blah. What can somebody who's a leader in a team or a parent running an organization, anything, when somebody's kind of in charge of the culture or at least curating, what's a way that this can be brought into a company culture or a group?
The most important one is to like frame the thing from the beginning is that it can't be failure. So like my best example of this is I think it was like Nike in the 90s over there. Like you'd walk into their main Seattle headquarters and they had a 4x8, so like the size of a piece of plywood sign, all done by push pin. And there was black push pins and white push pins, and it just said fail bigger. Immediately you walk in and they have framed success as large failures. They like boom, like so any way you can do the framing up front. This is an iterative process. Fail fast, fail often, fail fast. Learning, like just to see everything in that way, to set up a goal. Even I've seen people set up goals of iterations. Instead of we're going to get here, we're going to run 7 iterations. It's the same thing in like tracking sales data. Are you tracking how much money they brought in? Eventually you're going to have to, but the best thing to track is how many phone calls they made. The best thing to track is how many moves down a pipeline did they make. You're creating success in something that they can actually do instead of something that is somewhat beyond their control. So it's like, oh, if you take these steps, you will get here. So we're going to talk about the iteration of these steps rather than the like long-term goal for the metrics. So framing it from the beginning is one way to do it. Second is to reward failure. I've seen this in companies who had the biggest failure, like the most bold failure, who's the one who tried something, actually reward that. If you truly understand this. That is not a scary thing to do. That is a no-brainer. Like, you want innovation from your company, and you know that innovation is going to cost you money. This is the way it costs you money, is people trying stuff. Everybody has their own set of experiments. So to reward that, I think, is like an amazing thing to do. The other thing is, don't get angry when people fuck up. In our company recently, we had, well, I guess it was a couple years ago now, but somebody made a $50,000 mistake. I walked into the office and they're like, oh shit, I'm so sorry, Joe. I think I made 50. I just said, no problem. There was zero emotional backlash from me. There was just like, yeah, wow, that sucks. Okay. How are we going to handle it?
And I imagine there was even some anger to process at some point. Somehow.
No, there wasn't.
You never had a moment where you're like,
in this particular case, for them, yeah, definitely not for me, because of my reframing on it is so strong. There'll be anger if I don't see progress being made, right? If I get frustrated if I don't see the pace. But if I see someone trying something and it doesn't work, or somebody making a mistake, I'm totally good with it. I'm not good with the fact that pace isn't being kept. That's what will cause me frustration. Maybe like a mistake being made 2 or 3 times in a row for that's a whole different thing. Nobody wants to make mistakes. So if they're making a mistake, it means they're most likely trying something. And that's an important part of how we grow as a business.
This seems like another clear example of reframing success from outcomes to process to
Correct.
Learnings, even down to principles. It sounds like a lot of what you're just describing here is like, if the principles are being followed, if we're living by the principles, then we can consider that a success. And if we're not getting the results we want, then we can examine the principles.
Yeah, and I think that's a big thing. Like in families, it's especially families with young kids. So Esme and I talked about this on our podcast recently about her seeing like a family like correcting their kids from doing the dishes. Mm-hmm. They're doing the dishes and then they correct them. And so for that kid, they're learning that they're a failure. They're learning that they can't even wash dishes without being corrected. That's a deeply disempowering move that people make. So it's really important that when you're working in a family situation, that the iteration is far more important than the success. I do that with my kids all the time. Like, even if they mess up on something, sometimes I'm like, I just don't even say anything. Maybe I'll go back and fix it, but I won't let them know about it. Or maybe I'll be like, hey, here's this other component. Do you want to think about doing that? How do you want to do that? But I'm not going to criticize. I'm not going to step in and do it. It just doesn't help them have the self-esteem, doesn't help them be empowered, doesn't help them learn. None of that works. At least for normal life. Maybe when it comes to like being the best celloist in the world, there's some criticism needed. I don't know,
or critique, I would say, which might be different.
Yeah, which might be different.
Yeah.
But for just normal life, it's not really required. And then the other thing is, like with families, is if you notice, like little kids, their hands don't go over their heads the way an adult does. They're like, their wrists kind of go to like their ears when they're small enough, right? And so you can imagine that when our kids were like, I don't know, 2.5, 3 years old, they were setting the table. The table was higher than them. They were holding the dish above their head and then sliding it onto the table. And to us, that was really important. It was really important for them to know that they were capable. And yeah, we broke some dishes. We broke some dishes. But like to us, that was the framing. The framing was the attempt was more important than the success.
Yeah, one thing that I'm imagining this could all bump up against in somebody is a fear of recklessness. If I were to try this on, then I might become reckless. And if I were to do that as a base jumper, I'm like, oh, you know what? I'm just going to try and fail a bunch of things. Then that might actually lead to my death. What would you have to say to somebody who's like, but what I do is really high stakes. Tens of thousands of people depend on this getting right because I'm running a big company or whatever. I can't afford to be reckless.
Just to say, on the base jumping side, just as a great example of that, you've already framed it so that you can't fail, or that when you fail, you're dead anyway. So like, it doesn't really matter, right? If I live, then it was a success. So
walk away.
You've already done the reframing as a way to like that. That's the nature. How people go and do things like base jumping is they reframe failure. And so you've already done it. So point that out. There is this thing like, if I make this decision, then the economy of the free world could collapse. Right. Then like do some experiments, like find a very small democracy and try to do the financial engineering there. Do it within a company. Like the idea is, how do I run the simplest experiment that I can learn the most in the shortest amount of time? When you are practicing, you better be iterating. You better be trying over and over and over again.
There's a lot of interesting research on this, how important it is to go back and forth between like performance and play. Performance and play. And in something like wingsuiting, people often think, wow, there's no margin for error. Really, there's lots of margin for error. There's just specific margins that you need to maintain. And then within those margins, there's actually a lot that you can do. What you do in that space is what increases your capacity, your skill, your awareness, your body awareness, and everything else.
I love that, because that's even the idea of performance and play basically means a place where you can fail and a place where you can't fail. And so play in itself, like when you watch kids, no one's like, I failed at playing. Like kids, adults might do that. I didn't have enough fun. Generally, like kids don't fail at playing, and they're constantly learning and they're growing, and they learn and grow really, really quickly because they're in this state of play all the time. And there's a huge amount of data now that shows that like how important it is for kids to have free playtime. When we say connection over perfection, it's the exact same thing. We're reframing it. When we say wants over should, it's the exact same thing. We're saying like you can't fail in your wants, but you can fail in the shoulds. You can fail in perfection. You can't fail in connection. It's like everything we do is reframing the experience that way. Know that if that got taken away, we would not get the results that we get, because it's like we're just sitting there experimenting and learning. And it's why, like, it is the entire system that I did and that I was lucky enough to do, because I just hated authority. And I just got really lucky that is just that iterative mindset is just very, very productive and very, very enjoyable too.
One last observation on this topic of reframing is that what this does essentially is it brings the enjoyment of play into the performance of high stakes as deeply as one can, which just deepens the learning and the enjoyment, and ultimately doesn't have to sacrifice performance. It can increase and deepen.
It doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't. It doesn't. It does the exact opposite. Yeah. Especially over the long term. Yeah. Like especially over the time frame of years or decades. There's this great quote. I think I heard it from Tony Robbins, and it was people always overestimate what they can do in a year and underestimate what they can do in a decade. And if you look at like what the iterative mindset does in a decade, like every company that I know that has disrupted a industry inside of a decade has been very, very iterative in their approach. Maybe you don't lose weight this year, but you will be healthy if you constantly iterate on your health. A great example of this is Mark, who works with us. Like when you talk to him about his health, it's just like 1,000 iterations he has done over decades. And you look at him, you're like, holy crap, that dude is so healthy.
And this episode is another example of our iterative process.
Yes, it is.
Thanks for listening to The Art of Accomplishment. To hear more about how to use failure to your advantage, you can join our newsletter or check out our courses at artofaccomplishment.com.